Now I'm not sure if it's there yet. It's coming. Yep. I'm not going to talk for too long, I don't think, because I really would like to have a chance to engage with your questions and to hear your experiences as well. That would be really, really interesting for me. So yeah, I'll just say some things that hopefully will stimulate some conversation. That would be fantastic. So here we go. So that's the topic I was asked to speak to you about. So I'm talking about low socioeconomic communities and also rural communities. So I didn't put that in the title there, but often there's an overlap in those two anyway. So, oh, sorry, there was a speaker of mine switching off, if you heard that. Okay, so just moving on. Let's see how I can get this to move. Down there, I've got two screens. There we go. Some of you will recognise, probably you might recognise the bottom picture. That's a picture of Sydney, the famous Harbour Bridge. And I'm calling this slide A Tale of Two Countries, just to tell you something about the situation in Australia. On the next slide, I'll talk more about the international situation. But certainly in Australia, when we think about educational attainment, it is almost like there are two countries. There's the metropolitan centres, like big cities like Sydney and Melbourne. In fact, almost 20% of Australia's population live in the Sydney area. Most Australians live in big cities. It's one of the most highly urbanised countries in the world. But the vast majority of Australia's landmass is not metropolitan. So the photo at the top of the screen there was taken just a couple of weeks ago when I went on a drive just in New South Wales, the state of Australia where Sydney is. And that's 6-hour drive from Sydney. I was still in the same state. And this is a rural area where a few years ago it was in drought, but now it's looking rather nice. And it's just a different world in the little towns out there in terms of educational attainment and opportunities for kids. And these issues are not confined to Australia. They're certainly not confined to New South Wales. The OECD has produced data that show that relative to their peers in metropolitan areas, rural students perform less well. They tend to be in poorer communities, so they are lower socioeconomic status communities as well. Those communities tend to be more ethnically homogeneous and more cohesive, so that can the cohesion in those communities can be a real strength of them. Students in those communities are more likely to work for pay outside of school. They're less likely to think that they might attend university, and indeed they are less likely to complete a university qualification. They also tend to have less experienced and less well-qualified teachers. And this is especially a problem in mathematics and science. In Australia, there are schools that are not too far away from big cities that have no really well-qualified mathematics teacher, for example. So there's not even a well-qualified teacher to whom the other teachers can go for advice. So that is a real problem. And the further you get from a city, the more likely that is to be the case. In Australia, at least, and I discovered this when I was out there in the country recently, they're less likely to have reliable internet access and less access to specialist teachers and support staff. So the kinds of teachers who, like counsellors and psychologists and career advisors and those kinds of people, are harder to find in rural schools. So lots of overlap between those factors. I'm not sure why my slide moved on, but it did, so I'll leave it there. Okay. So a lot of my work has been about the beliefs of teachers. And so I've looked in a number of studies over the years about the beliefs teachers have about mathematics and mathematics learning and teaching and so on. But more recently, I've been doing more work on rural and low SES schools. Low SES schools are not just rural, but as I said, there's some overlap there. and looking at the beliefs of teachers about students in those places. And a lot of it, although I know teachers, and I'll say a little bit more about why I think teachers say these kinds of things, you could describe some of the things they say as almost blaming the victim. So you'll notice from those quotes that came from a study that I did back in Tasmania, it's an island state at the south of Australia where I used to live, they're talking about the problems being originating in the families that the students come from. They're talking about a degree of itinerancy as well, where families come and go, and when their employment's probably not stable and so forth. The students are disinterested. The families don't value education at all. And the teachers recognise that this is a problem that's going to be hard to change. The students say, this other next teacher said, are not motivated in core subjects, so things like maths and English. And again, they're saying that the families don't see those skills as important or relevant for those students. And they note, of course, that students who have supportive families achieve at a much higher level. One of the most shocking quotes I have ever heard is from a former student who actually said that she was talking about her experience of going to school in just a very low SES place. It was in a largish town, actually, so not particularly rural, but it was definitely low SES. And she talked a lot about spending time in class, not actually learning, not focusing on any work, not being expected to, just chatting and sitting around and bantering with the teacher and not really doing very much. And it was only when she went on to a different school for further education, which was very unusual for students from the school she had been at, that she realised that, oh, I should have just asked to be taught. And she didn't realise that she had to do that, and I guess she shouldn't. So there are some those sorts of beliefs where teachers are laying the problem at the feet of the family. It's not very helpful. It's not going to lead to teaching that's going to assist those students. Even if the things they're saying about their family problems are true, it's still not very helpful. And I tend to see this, and as I've explored this over the years, as not that teachers don't care about students and that they don't want to assist these students. I think they really, really do. But often they're just at a loss as to how to. The problem seems so big. The students have real needs beyond their educational needs. Sometimes they come to school perhaps not having breakfast, not terribly well clothed. And so the teachers see all of these problems. They're not quite sure what to do. The students seem resistant to their efforts to teach them, and they don't know what to do about that. And so locating the problem outside of themselves and things they can affect is almost a protective mechanism for teachers, I think. So I don't blame teachers at all for these kinds of things. I think they're doing their best, but nevertheless it's not helpful. This next slide are some other beliefs that have come out of various studies that we've done over the years. Teachers and even school principals have said things like these students, meaning ones in a low SES school or a rural school, have said that these students don't need high-level maths. So they're making assumptions there about the kinds of further study and the kinds of careers that are relevant for the students in their schools. Sometimes they're just referring to the lower streams, sometimes to most of the kids in the schools. And sometimes this is also a way to rationalise the fact that we can't get a well-qualified maths teacher to teach the most demanding maths subjects in the senior years of secondary school. So we can kind of justify that by saying, oh, well, these students aren't going to want to do that anyway. They don't want to go to university. None of them are going to be doctors or engineers, so it doesn't matter. So that's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy as well. In the most extreme cases, I have seen schools where they weren't even offering science in years 9 and 10 because these students don't need that. And again, that made it easier to offer less maths as well, or lower level maths. There is evidence that teachers on average in low SES schools see those students as less capable than students in more affluent schools. So that's not helpful either. I've shared that result with some of the teachers from whom I got that result. This was a study of several hundred teachers, where we just divided the schools around the median of the SES measure we were using, and there was definitely a statistical difference between the two halves of the sample. Teachers were surprised and a little bit outraged by that, but nevertheless, that's what the data say. There's also, from other studies, I've found that teachers make assumptions about ability based on student behaviours and even their appearance. So things like, you know, I've just asked teachers in some studies, how do you know a student's good at maths, and you know, what characterises them? And they'll say things like they don't know their basic facts and so on, but then they'll go on to say a whole lot of things like they miss classes, they come late, they don't bring equipment with them, they're not motivated, and so they're talking about a whole lot of behavioural things that are not necessarily anything to do with ability, but those things are all lumped in with assumptions about their ability. The third dot point there is one I alluded to on the previous slide. You know, we can't expect children who come from these terrible home backgrounds to learn. And so that can translate into schools providing pastoral support and all kinds of other supports before they address academic attainment. And my view would be that, of course, we need to look after the students' you know, needs for food if they come to school without having a breakfast and so on, and we do need to provide pastoral support, but we also at the same time need to address academic supports as well. The study that finding came from was one in which the teachers also identified that one of the main barriers to students continuing with their education and finishing secondary school was actually their low literacy and numeracy skills. But all the supports in the school were focusing on pastoral kinds of supports instead. So that didn't quite make sense logically. Again, neither these students nor their parents value education. The last one there is one that I've actually heard from researchers in the rural education space in particular, but sometimes in relation to low SES as well, where they talk about how when we talk about success in terms of attainment on standardised tests and university entrance and those kinds of things, that we're imposing a metrocentric or middle class view of success upon students for whom that might not be appropriate, and that we should therefore define success differently for students from low SES and rural areas. I think that's coming from a place of not wanting to look at these students from a deficit kind of viewpoint, which is very important and admirable, but it can also have the effect of almost trying to define the problem away. If we say that success is different for these students, we're really entrenching lower academic expectations, and that's not helpful. That's my view anyway. So, and then a lot of what I've been trying to grapple with for the last quite a few years actually is how we can actually influence teachers' beliefs. And there's a lot of research that's been done over many decades that shows that beliefs are really quite hard to shift in the long term. And there are all kinds of debates about whether changing teachers' behaviour, changing their practice leads to change beliefs, or whether you have to change the beliefs first and so on. I think the consensus generally is that it's a bit of both, you work on both. But there are particular beliefs that are implicated in the issues I've just been talking about that are what we call quite central, which means they're very connected to other beliefs that teachers have. So they are the most hard to change. They're often connected to the teacher's own identity as a teacher. So you'll recall before I talked about how some of those beliefs that teachers have in laying the blame for problems outside of themselves are about protecting themselves and their own identity as an effective teacher. So they can protect that by saying, well, it's not my teaching, it's the family that these children come from. So those beliefs are most hard to change. They're often beliefs that are formed quite early in life from teachers' own experience of going to school or their early experiences of teaching. And because they've been formed early, lots of other beliefs do tend to be connected to them, so that makes them central. So because of all of that, belief change is really difficult work. Now, I'm just mindful of the time. I could tell you some stories about some of the ways that I've formed my own beliefs about this, just to illustrate, but I might leave that for now, and it might come up and might be relevant in our conversation because I think I've probably talked for long enough. So I'll finish with this photo, which is actually the laneway into the farm where I spent a fair bit of my childhood. So that's a nice little rural place where I grew up in Tasmania, and my email's there as well, so we can continue the conversation afterward if you'd like. Okay, I'll stop sharing and